The first thing people noticed about Choi Joon-Ho as he entered a room wasn't the sharp cut of his charcoal suit, although it did fit him like a finely crafted armor. It wasn't the chilling, extreme stillness of his gaze that made even seasoned board members rethink their choices. It wasn't even the graceful stride of a man who had been prepared for greatness since birth. What caught their attention first was the weight. This wasn't a physical weight. It was the heavy, suffocating presence of a man who moved only when a greater force guided him. Joon-Ho mastered this commanding aura from Madame Kang, a woman who wore her authority like a ragged crown. She hadn't merely raised a son, she had shaped a weapon. In the glass and steel landscape of Seoul, Joon-Ho was known as the calculated shadow, a man who had built an empire on a singular, blood-bound rule. His mother's approval was the air he breathed, and she controlled that air. Seoul bowed to Choi Joon-Ho because he bowed to Madame Kang. This was the natural order until the city's corporate silence was broken by a briefcase filled with courage and a spirit that refused to submit. Ophelia Bennet. She didn't come to Seoul to whisper, she came to make the room take notice. As a consultant fueled by passion, she brought a Detroit-style defiance that made Joon-Ho's world of rigid expectations start to smolder. While others regarded Joon-Ho as a god, Ophelia saw a man trapped in a gilded cage, and she was the only one bold enough to tell him his cage was closing in. On the morning the foundations of the Choi dynasty began to crumble, Joon-Ho stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass of his 32nd floor fortress in Gangnam. He held a coffee cup worth more than most people's monthly rent, watching the sun rise over a city he technically owned but had never truly experienced. Dressed like a king, custom wool silver cufflinks that glinted like unsheathed blades, he waited for the woman who would force him to choose between his legacy and his soul. A storm was approaching, cold and relentless. For the first time in 30 years, Choi Joon-Ho wasn't looking to his mother for protection. He was watching the door, expecting the quiet defiance of Ophelia Bennet to come in and ignite change. The 32nd floor of the Choi Tower didn't just overlook Gangnam. It towered over it like a silent sentinel of glass and steel. Inside, the air was perfectly filtered, lacking the scent of the streets, the exhaust from the buses, or the sweat of the 10 million people bustling below. Choi Joon-Ho stood at the center of this vacuum, a man shaped from the same unyielding material as his desk. Every action was a calculated use of force, a dance of mother-approved perfection ingrained in him before he learned to walk. To the outside world, he was the leader of an empire that thrived in the shadows of logistics and high-end hospitality. But within these walls, the setup was a cage designed by his mother. Madame Kang didn't just run the Jihan group. She regulated the very rhythm of his life. Her approval was the unseen ink on every contract he signed, the silent drive behind every swift, clean and certain choice he made. He was a man of absolute certainty, raised with the conviction that composure was the only legacy worth having. His office was a shrine of understated prestige. The walls were made of dark, polished wood, and the furniture carried a weight that suggested long-standing wealth. On his wrist, a vintage Longines, a model unavailable for years, ticked with the precision of his heartbeat. Looking at his reflection in the glass, he saw a man who had never been told no but had also never truly said yes to anything on his own. Joon-Ho took a sip of his coffee, expensive, dark and bitter, and felt the crushing burden of his own legacy. At 33 he was the sole leader of a towering empire, yet he lived in the focused blankness of a man who felt nearly alone. There were no gaps in his life because Madame Kang had crafted it to be seamless, filling every hour with strategy and every silence with her shadow. He was a shadow son, a prey on a silk and gold leash, waiting for a life that had never really belonged to him to start. Below him, the city pulsed with an energy he respected but didn't share. He was the storm brewing before it hit the city, sharp, dangerous, and unavoidable. Yet, as the morning light struck the glass, he found himself anticipating a disruption, a crack in the facade, a single unfiltered word that might finally set him free. The boardroom of the Choi Tower was filled with tense silence, a space heavy with the aroma of expensive cologne and the tension of collective anxiety. 12 men sat in an arc of charcoal and navy, their eyes fixed on the empty mahogany head of the table like subjects awaiting a verdict. This place exuded power without a word spoken, a sanctuary of high-stakes tension where every whisper was a calculated gamble. The design aimed to make one feel small, but as the heavy oak doors creaked open, The room didn't just notice the arrival, it shifted. Ophelia Bennet didn't walk into the room, she filled it. She entered carrying a briefcase brimming with courage and a silence charged with intent, stepping in with a grace learned from her grandmother that served as her true armor. Dressed in a tailored black blazer dress, structured at the shoulders as if ready for confrontation, and heels that clicked against the marble like the rhythm of a closing argument, her rich, dark curls framed her face, a crown of natural defiance that refused to be adjusted for anyone's comfort. She arrived precisely 4 minutes before the meeting, late enough to cause a stir, early enough to be seen as a threat. As she took her seat, 12 pairs of eyes turned to her, and for the first time in Choi Group's history, they couldn't return to their documents. She settled into the leather chair with the calm of a woman who hadn't crashed a meeting but simply arrived at a discussion that hadn't realized it needed her. Then the atmosphere shifted. The air grew cold and precise as Choi Joon-Ho entered, flanked by security in subtle charcoal suits. He was a man of unyielding, exploitative confidence, his jawline indicating absolute control. He scanned the room, noting exits and potential allies as if he owned the space, until his gaze landed on her. He stopped, just a brief moment of recalibration that only a keen observer would notice. Ophelia was such an observer. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, silently challenging him, before reaching into her briefcase and uncapping her pen. In that heartbeat of silence, the board members sensed a shift in the atmosphere. The calculated shadow had finally encountered a light that refused to fade, and as Joon-Ho took a seat directly across from her, the room began to orient itself around 2 new formidable forces. The meeting began with the hollow rhythmic cadence of standard corporate niceties, an act Choi Joon-Ho had experienced 1,000 times. The Lure acquisition lay on the mahogany table like a sacrificial offering, a luxury mixed-use development in Mapogu that everyone wanted to seize. The numbers were impressive, the location strategic, but the vision felt lifeless. Joon-Ho watched 3 developers present their interests, their words filled with synergy and leverage, terms that had the hollow sound of rattling dry bones. Then Joon-Ho spoke. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. Attention naturally gravitated toward him as if he were a magnet. He talked about legacy architecture and the cultural importance of the neighborhood, a strategy that was both surprising and exact. He was the leader, the shadow son, delivering a sermon of certainty that allowed no room for disagreement. "I think Mr. Choi makes a strong argument for legacy," a voice interrupted. It was Ophelia. Her warm, measured tone filled the room effortlessly. Joon-Ho felt the atmosphere change. "But I'd challenge your residential model," she said, locking her gaze onto his with the defiance of a Detroit winter. "At that price point you aren't creating a community. You're building an attractive island for people who already own 3 properties. You're taking from Mapogu, not bringing life into it. The vision needs a middle tier, or it's just a gilded cage that locals will only watch from the outside." The silence that followed was not respectful. It was the stunned quiet of a man who had not anticipated a challenge. Joon-Ho felt a strange heat bloom behind his ribs, a sensation that felt out of place in a boardroom. It wasn't anger. It was the shocking realization that someone was finally seeing beyond the structure of his position into the deeper workings of his mind. "You're Ophelia Bennet," he said, his voice dropping. It wasn't a question. "I am," she replied, offering a quiet smile, the one her grandmother taught her to use when the room finally settled. "And you're Choi Joon-Ho. I've heard good things about you." The corner of his mouth moved, not into a smile but a hint of one. In that moment, the corporate mask he wore felt impossibly heavy. For the first time in 30 years, the shadow son wasn't focused on his mother's approval. He was curious about what else this woman could see that he had missed. The dinner was not a date. Ophelia Bennet reminded herself of this during the long neon-lit drive through Cheongdam-dong. She sat in the back of the sleek Genesis, watching the flashing lights of Seoul blur into golden ribbons, her reflection in the tinted glass as unyielding as Detroit steel. She had dressed for a negotiation, wearing a caramel-colored floor-length gown of matte crepe, sleeveless with a deep V that suggested elegance rather than provocation, and a back that dipped to the base of her spine in a single bold line. She wasn't trying to impress the shadow son. She was simply holding herself to the high standard she never let slip. The restaurant was a private kaiseki space, an oasis of subtle prestige with no sign on the door, just a brass handle and the heavy silence of absolute power. Choi Joon-Ho was already there, standing by the window with the focused stillness of a man who owned the atmosphere. He turned as she entered, his navy suit tailored to fit him perfectly, a vintage watch on his wrist indicating old money. His eyes scanned her with sudden clarity, and then he did something rare for him. He pulled out her chair. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm as she settled into the intimate space. There were no menus. The chef would bring what was best and a bottle of champagne chilled in ice, the exact label she preferred. "You looked up what I drink," she noted, meeting his gaze without the caution he was used to. "I look into everything before a meeting," he said, his voice calm and unhurried. "This isn't a meeting," she replied, leaning forward until the warm light caught the gold cuffs on her wrists. "No," he agreed, the hint of a smile almost breaking through. "It isn't." As the courses arrived, delicate, precise, beautiful, the conversation flowed around the Lure building with the careful precision of two experts. But between the fourth and fifth courses, the business facade shattered. "You're not from money," Joon-Ho observed, not as an insult but as a recognition of her attitude toward it. Ophelia didn't hesitate. She spoke of the east side of Detroit, of a grandmother who arrived from Guyana with $40 and the belief that dignity was armor you never took off. She described a father who loved his family but wasn't great at being there, sharing her life's emotional landscape without bitterness. A change flashed across Joon-Ho's face, not pity but a rare understanding. He told her about his father, a man of iron hands and firm beliefs who passed away 4 years ago, leaving behind an empire rooted in the illusion of control. It was the most personal thing he had said in years, a test to see if the words could break the silence. "To the difficult people who made us extraordinary," Ophelia said, raising her glass. Joon-Ho paused for a moment, his usual composure softening just enough to let light through, then raised his own. The spark of intrigue ignited, something that no corporate strategy could put out. The air in the Choi executive suite didn't just grow cold. It became a place where only the strongest survived. Madame Kang sat behind her desk of polished rosewood, her silver hair pinned up with precise skill, mirroring her sharp mind. She didn't need to be in the boardroom to sense that her son's world was shifting. She felt the change in the atmosphere, a sharp vibration indicating that a strong presence had entered Joon-Ho's life. Joon-Ho had always moved with the practiced perfection that his mother allowed him. But lately, the certainty in his stride was replaced by a slight hesitation that only a woman who had shaped his every step could notice. It was the defiance of Ophelia Bennet, a woman who strode into rooms and made them adjust to her, that began to fray the edges of his strict discipline. Madame Kang didn't believe in coincidence, she believed in control. She watched the surveillance feeds, the unexpected Thursday lunches and how Joon-Ho now looked at his phone with a genuine smile that reached parts of his face that hadn't felt that way in a while. She noticed how he had started saying please to the staff without being prompted, a sign of the softness she had fought for 30 years to keep at bay. "Director Lim," she said, her voice calm yet commanding. Her internal operations head appeared instantly, expressionless. "I want a complete dossier on Miss Bennet. Not the professional one, I want to understand the shape of her mind. I need to know why my son is choosing intrigue over intimidation." She watched the screen as Joon-Ho stood at his window, gazing at the Seoul skyline as if he finally claimed a stake in it, instead of merely guarding it for her. Madame Kang narrowed her eyes, a voracious stillness taking hold. Ophelia Bennet was not just a consultant. She was a disruption, a force that threatened to dismantle the golden cage Madame Kang had carefully built. In the world of the Choi Group, disruptions weren't negotiated with. They were eliminated with the precise skill of a woman who never apologized for her actions. Joon-Ho was a shadow son, and Madame Kang intended to ensure he never forgot that his light was just a reflection of her own power. The silence of the 32nd floor had always been absolute, an empty space where Choi Joon-Ho moved as a product of his mother's design. But by May, a fragile peace began to take root in his routine. It lingered in the Thursday lunches that had appeared unexpectedly, turning into a fixture that neither he nor Ophelia Bennet officially agreed to keep, yet neither cancelled. These moments formed a separate life that Joon-Ho was building quietly, without asking for Madame Kang's approval. They met at a small, prestigious fusion restaurant in Hanam-dong, so exclusive that the owner hadn't offered menus for months. Here the calculated shadow, was coming apart, not through force but through the distinct shape of Ophelia's mind. She didn't listen with the sharp, tactical focus of a rival. She listened as if she were mapping the very structure of his soul. When she laughed, an unrestrained joy that turned her own jokes into a victory, Joon-Ho found himself leaning in without thought. It was a rare, exciting kind of fun that made his expensive coffee and antique rosewood desk feel like artifacts from someone else's life. He had started to change in ways that were academic to her but profound to him. He began saying please to the waitstaff without prompting. That simple word felt like a crack in the heavy armor his father had instilled in him. By the 5th month of knowing her, he had even made a significant donation to a literacy foundation in Mapogu, an act of sentimentality that the Jihyun group normally regarded as a mistake. People change, Ophelia had said casually while discussing the city's changing skylines. Joon-Ho had met her gaze briefly, saying nothing. His thumb moved slowly across his knuckles, making steady adjustments. He was becoming a man who could notice a sesame seed on a jawline or the narrowing of a woman's eyes when she was solving a problem. But as he returned to the tower, the familiar tension returned. He understood that this friendship existed in the hours between meetings, a secret document awaiting its final signatures in the silence of his heart. He was trying his best not to dwell on the absence he felt, even as his apartment grew too quiet the moment she left. He had never stumbled before, yet now he was navigating a path without a clear definition, protecting a peace that was both fragile and beautiful. In Madame Kang's private study, the air didn't just grow cold. It became a vacuum where only the most disciplined could thrive. She sat behind her desk, made of ancient, polished rosewood. Her silver hair was pinned up with precise control that matched her sharp intellect. She didn't need to be in the boardroom to sense that her son's world was shifting. She felt the change in the atmosphere, a rough vibration indicating that someone significant had entered Joon-Ho's life. Joon-Ho stood before her, a testament to her own creation, but his confident stride had shifted to something more cautious. Madame Kang didn't believe in luck. She believed in strategy and complete control. She noted the Thursday lunches that appeared suddenly and how her son now looked at his phone with a genuine smile. That smile was a sign of a softness she had worked against for 30 years. "You are moving with a lot of nerve lately, Joon-Ho," she said, her voice steady and commanding. She didn't look up from the report she was reading. "And it's not your own." Joon-Ho stayed silent, his posture still showing control, but his mother noticed that the shadow son was beginning to seek a light she had never given him. He had never been told no, yet now he wandered a path that had no clear definition. "Ophelia Bennet is not a consultant," Madame Kang continued, finally locking eyes with him. Her gaze was sharp and unforgiving, as if she never regretted her observations. "She is a disruption. A force that does not care about the city she is about to reach." She leaned forward, the desk lamp highlighting the strength of her authority. "She is a woman who has never faced a no, and she will not start with you. If you continue this intrigue, she will not just alter your plans. She will dismantle everything you've built." The warning settled in the clinical silence of the room, heavy and undeniable. For the first time, Joon-Ho felt the weight of his own legacy, a life he had defended but never truly owned. Madame Kang observed him, waiting for the moment of his surrender, but behind Joon-Ho's eyes, something fundamental had shifted, revealing a deep certainty that the room he believed was his was no longer enough. The night was a chaotic mix of neon and shadow, with cold soul rain slicking the pavement until the city glowed like a bruise. Choi Joon-Ho stood on the edge of the world, or at least the version his mother had built for him. The storm pounded against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the executive suite. Behind him, silence was complete, the type of silence that signaled not a problem but a finality. Madame Kang sat in the center of the shadows, her shape distinct and commanding. She spoke without raising her voice, she didn't need to. The atmosphere shifted in her presence, becoming thin and clinical, a space designed to drain away emotion and preserve only the strategic. "You have been running out of options, Joon-Ho," she said, her voice low and steady. The Sinclair-Jihyun alliance was a masterclass in construction, but its foundation has become weak and sentimental. She stood, the silk of her robe whispering against the desk. "Ophelia Bennet is a disruption. A force that has inserted itself into your life without consent." Joon-Ho watched the rain trace streaks on the glass, his jaw set with an unyielding calm that defined him. He felt the immense weight of 33 years of certainty, every deal and alliance under the control of the woman standing behind him. "Get rid of her," Madame Kang instructed, her words landing decisively as if sealing a crucial document. "End the lunches. Close the door you've forgotten to lock. If she stays, you will walk out of this tower with nothing. No inheritance, no company, no legacy. You will be a man without direction." Under the harsh city lights, Joon-Ho's world split in two. For the first time he hesitated, not moving with the calculated precision of someone used to control. It was a brief pause of reconsideration, so fleeting that only someone closely watching would perceive it, and Madame Kang was attentively observing. He thought of Ophelia, the woman who removed her shoes on rooftops and laughed with joy, the only person who had seen in him the answer to a lifelong question. This choice felt like a storm he couldn't escape, a territory where certainty was threatening and the bravest thing he could do was embrace the chaos. He stood in the quiet, a shadow sun realizing that the cage he had guarded for so long was now irrevocably on fire. The air between them in the small Hanamdong restaurant had lost its usual balance, replaced by an unsettling static that made the fine porcelain feel heavy. Choi Joon-Ho sat across from Ophelia, his posture still reflecting control, but his eyes revealed a battle of silent shadows. For 33 years he had been a man of total certainty, a wolf who never faltered because his mother held the reins. Now the weight of Madame Kang's ultimatum felt like a force he couldn't outrun. Ophelia studied him, noticing the hesitance she had never seen before. She was a woman who had built an empire from resilience and lived by a standard that didn't take breaks. She recognized the stillness of a man whose world was shifting under him. She observed the shadow sun, struggling to maintain his armor, his thumb moving slowly across his knuckles, signaling a breakdown. "Joon-Ho," she said, her voice warm and steady, filling the space even as the atmosphere became tense. He didn't look up. He was a man who had never asked for permission, now realizing that the price for his legacy could be the very person who made him feel understood. The conflict within him was visible in his rigid shoulders, a struggle of a man forced to choose between the life he protected and the soul he had finally discovered. Ophelia sensed the weight of his decision before he spoke. She knew that love shouldn't cost someone their life, and she refused to be the reason he became a man without purpose. She reached across the table, her hand near his for a lingering moment, then pulled back and stood. "I have a 7 a.m. call," she said, her voice normal, a fiction she crafted to give him the distance he couldn't claim. She walked to the door, her heels clicking against the floor with the rhythm of a closing argument, leaving him in the focused blankness of his own tower. She vanished into the streaks of neon and gold, sensing that her absence was the only way to let him find the man he was meant to be. Joon-Ho remained at the table, a master of construction watching the most extraordinary thing in his life disappear because he was still too afraid to stay open to the space he couldn't control. The 32nd floor had returned to its clinical architectural perfection, but the air inside the glass sentinel had become a vacuum that Choi Joon-Ho could no longer breathe. Ophelia Bennet was gone, and her absence had a specific keen texture that he could only describe as a structural failure of his own soul. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the neon streaks of Gangnam, realizing that while he technically owned a piece of the city, he was more of a prisoner than its commander. The office remained a cathedral of high-status restraint, every mahogany surface polished to a mirror finish because perfection did not take days off. He moved through his schedule with the surgical precision of a man who had been raised to believe that composure was the only inheritance worth leaving, yet every mother-approved decision now felt like the rattling of dry bones. He sat at the center of his hollow empire, surrounded by people who feared him, served him, and respected him, yet not one of them would have told him if he was bleeding out in front of them. He looked at his vintage longines, the ticking a rhythmic reminder of the hours between meetings that used to be lived in the warmth of Ophelia's quiet defiance. He missed the way she laughed from her whole body and the specific face she made when she was dismantling his most certain arguments. Without her, the silence of his apartment in Mapogu was no longer a sanctuary. It was a loaded, suffocating weight that proved he had engineered a life with no obvious gap, yet remained entirely alone. Madame Kang's shadow loomed larger than ever, her iron grip tightening as the Sinclair group moved toward the coast without him. He saw her reflection in the glass, The strategist, the control, the woman who believed certainty was the only goal. But as Joon-Ho watched the city wake up, he realized the bracing was no longer a defense. It was a cage. The legacy he had guarded for 33 years was a fiction he had been writing for his mother, and he was finally running out of plot. The empire was impeccable, certain, and measured, but as the rain began to streak the cold city lights, Choi Joon-Ho realized that a home built on fear was just a beautiful island that he was finally ready to leave behind. Choi Joon-Ho stood in the center of the boardroom, but for the first time he was not the anchor of its heavy mahogany silence. The air was thin, clinical, and reeking of the mother-approved perfection he had worn like leaden armor for 33 years. He looked at the faces of the board. Men who operated on synergy and leverage, men who had never seen the specific shape of a soul beneath a balance sheet. He felt the crushing gravity of the legacy he was expected to guard, a life he had inherited but never truly owned. "The residential model is dead," he said, his voice dropping into a low, unhurried register that carried the room without effort. A rough static moved through the directors. They looked at Madame Kang, waiting for the strategist to pull the strings back into place. She sat at the head of the table, her silver hair pinned up like a ragged crown, her gaze a voracious stillness that never apologized for its incisions. "Joon-Ho," she warned, the word a low blade of authority. "I'm done with the fiction," Joon-Ho countered, meeting her eyes with a Detroit-style defiance he had learned from a woman who refused to shrink. "We've been building islands, not communities. We've been choosing good things, the things that look impressive in a quarterly report, over accurate things. The truth is, this empire is a gilded cage, and I am the only one who realized the door was never braced." He reached into his pocket and produced his phone, the screen lighting up with a photo of a catastrophic bento box. A reminder of a woman who laughed from her whole body and saw every version of him simultaneously. The board stared, their eyes cataloging a structural failure of the man they thought they knew. "You are walking into a space you can't control," Madame Kang said, her voice unhurried and precise, yet laced with the threat of total extraction. "If you do this, there is no inheritance. No destination." "Then I'll find the way," Joon-Ho said, his jaw an architectural reference of absolute certainty. He didn't look at the board. He looked at his mother, the architect of his cage, and felt the cellular certainty that the room he thought he owned was no longer enough. He walked to the door, his heels clicking with the rhythm of a closing argument. He was no longer a shadow son or a CEO under control. He was a man running out of plot, finally ready to dismantle the architecture of a life that was never truly his. The rain at Incheon did not fall. It commanded, a relentless silver deluge that turned the world into a blurred landscape of neon and grief. Choi Joon-Ho moved through the terminal not as a CEO, but as a man stripped of his architecture. There were no charcoal-suited guards flanking him, no private elevators to bypass the masses, and no mother-approved destination waiting at the end of the hall. For the first time in 33 years he was unanchored, a master of construction who had realized his own heart was the only thing worth building. He scanned the departures with the frantic, practiced scan of a man cataloging his last chance at survival. Every face in the crowd was a stranger, indifferent and magnificent, living lives he had once observed from a 32nd floor fortress. He felt the crushing weight of Ophelia's absence, a texture of silence so sharp it felt like a structural failure. He was a man who had never stumbled, yet here he was, sliding against the polished floor, his breath hitching in a way that Madame Kang would have called a weakness, but which felt to him like the first honest thing he'd ever owned. He found her near the gate, a solitary figure draped in the quiet defiance he had come to love. Ophelia was standing by the glass, her heels dangling from 2 fingers as she watched the planes struggle against the storm, looking exactly like the Detroit queen who had taught him that you never walk into a room explaining yourself. "Ophelia," he called out, his voice low and different, carrying the raw, unedited honesty of a man who had finally stopped lying to himself. She turned, her hair a halo of dark coils damp from the trek to the terminal, and for a half-beat, the air between them was quietly, irrevocably rearranged. She looked at him, not at the Brioni suit or the vintage watch, but at the man who had walked away from an empire without asking for permission. "You came unscheduled," she said softly, her voice warm and measured, mirroring the first night their worlds had collided. "I came for the real thing," Joon-Ho replied, stepping into her space and letting the room adjust to them. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb moving once across her knuckles, slow and certain. He wasn't catching something, he was coming home. In the middle of the crowded terminal, with the rain hammering against the glass, Choi Joon-Ho finally let the bracing go and chose the only life that had ever truly felt like his own. The rain continued its relentless assault on the terminal glass, but inside the small space they had carved out of the chaos, the storm had finally stilled. Choi Joon-Ho stood before Ophelia Bennet, his hands no longer reaching for the cold rails of a corporate balcony, but anchored to the only truth he had left. He looked at her with a face that had finally shed its architectural armor, softened, open and dangerously honest. I spent 33 years believing that certainty was the only inheritance worth leaving, he said, his voice low and vibrating with the weight of a man who had finally stopped editing himself. I thought if I followed every map my mother drew, I'd eventually find a destination that felt like home. But the rooms were always cold, Ophelia. They were built for a version of me that didn't exist. He tightened his grip on her hand, his thumb moving with a slow, cellular certainty across her knuckles. When you walked into that boardroom, you didn't ask for permission to exist. You didn't adjust your light to make my cage look more impressive. You just were. And in that silence, I realized I'd been holding a breath for a lifetime. Ophelia watched him, her dark eyes reflecting the neon glow of the rain-slicked runway, her quiet defiance now tempered with a brilliant, unhurried warmth. She didn't offer him a way back to the golden cage. She simply waited for him to finish the walk he had started. My mother gave me an ultimatum, Joon-Ho continued, the bracing for her approval finally, irrevocably gone. She told me to choose between the legacy and the life. And I realized there is no legacy without the man I became the moment I met you. For once in my life, I'm not choosing a deal or a strategy. I'm choosing me. And my me includes you. The terminal hummed around them, 10 million lives moving at their usual indifferent speed. But for Joon-Ho, the architecture of the world had finally aligned. He wasn't catching a flight. He was arriving at the only destination that mattered. So, he said, his voice dropping to a raw, unedited whisper. If you're still looking for the real thing, it's standing right here in the rain. Ophelia smiled. The full one, the real one, the one that Detroit had sharpened and Seoul had finally earned. Obviously, yes, she said, her voice holding with the strength of a woman who had never negotiated herself down. As he gathered her against him, feeling the long, complete exhale of a man who had finally come home, the ring of his mother's control shattered, replaced by a humming silence that felt exactly like freedom. 1 year had bled into the tapestry of the city, but for Choi Joon-Ho, time was no longer a clinical measurement of corporate survival. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass of their apartment in Mapogu, 12 floors up from the restless hum of Seoul, watching the twilight settle like a promise. The architecture of his life had been entirely rearranged, not by the cold hand of a strategist, but by the steady, unhurried warmth of the woman standing beside him. The Bennet Group had grown, expanding into new verticals with a joint strategic advisory role that operated with the elegance of true equals. Joon-Ho had not asked Ophelia to surrender a single piece of her sovereignty, for he had learned that the most extraordinary things happen in the space you cannot control. He was no longer the shadow son or the commander of a hollow empire. He was a man who had found a destination that didn't require a map. Ophelia leaned against him, the city light catching the dark coils of her hair and the wide band of brushed gold on her finger. The wine-red sapphire didn't shout its value to the room. It hummed with the quiet, cellular certainty of a love that had nowhere else to go. It was the real thing, the kind of jewelry her grandmother had promised wouldn't feel like catching something but like coming home. Joon-Ho heard the familiar sound of his key, the specific footstep of a man who no longer carried the weight of a leash. He looked at Ophelia, and for the first time in his life he smiled without restraint, not the social mask he deployed in boardrooms, but a real, involuntary full smile that reached the places in his face that had once been frozen. He had become a man who deserved the things she saw in him. A man who brought her coffee exactly as she took it and remembered the things mentioned only once in passing. Joon-Ho, she said softly, the silence between them fully loaded and deeply intimate. I'm pregnant. The arms he had wrapped around her waist went still, then slowly they tightened with a long, complete exhale. He didn't need to check with a board or wait for a strategist's approval. He simply held her, feeling the extraordinary, ordinary weight of everything they had become. In a world that had once told them to be less and expect less, they had built a life so full and so real that love was the only law left to follow. Below them, the city moved at its usual speed, but inside their 12th-floor sanctuary, the ring on Ophelia's finger continued to hum, and Choi Joon-Ho finally knew what it felt like to be free.